Welcome to Training 1, Module 4. Step 3, Part 2, the Independent Site Assessment. This training is intended for users of the assurance process, including copper producer practitioners and copper mark assessors. This module covers the second part of Step 3 of the copper mark assurance process, the Independent Site Assessment. Overview of the Independent Site Assessment. To complete the third step of the copper mark assurance process, an independent site assessment is required. In this part, an independent assessor or team of assessors visits the copper producer site to assess conformance against the RRA criteria. The copper mark requires that all criteria are independently assessed at the site level. This does not include criteria that are not applicable to the operations. The results of the assessment must provide a sufficient level of confidence for the copper mark to decide whether to award the copper producer the copper mark. As discussed in Training 1 Module 3, the scope of the independent site assessment is determined by the copper mark based on the recommendations from the independent review report. The recommendations are based on the copper producer's self-assessment, existing certifications or externally assured management systems, and publicly available information. All criteria are in scope unless the independent review process confirms that that criterion is not applicable, fully met through an equivalent site assessment, and there are no potential issues raised through due diligence for that criterion, or partially met through an equivalent site assessment, in which case only the areas that were not previously assessed on site are in scope. The scope of the site assessment includes all operations under the management control of the site. A site may comprise several activities in the same geographic area, even if in different locations. The copper producer informs the copper mark of this in the letter of commitment. This may include some or all of the following types of operations: mining, blending, solvent extraction and electrowinning, smelting and/or refining. The infrastructure related to these operations are also in scope of the site assessment and include the locations housing the principal activities and operations associated with mining and extraction and/or smelting and refining of copper, all locations and buildings for the management of waste, storing, and maintenance of equipment, offices and administration and other auxiliary activities, activities in buildings critical to the viability of the copper producer's site operation, such as transport and storage warehouses, all locations and buildings for business activities and management processes, and associated infrastructure under the control of management, such as roads, railroads, and ports. The copper mark assurance process is currently available for copper producers. Such entities might produce other metals as well as copper. Included in the copper supply chain are multi-metal producers that produce, for example, gold, nickel, lead, molybdenum, and zinc alongside copper. Because the program is site-based and focused on management systems, all metals produced at that site are included in the scope of the assessment. The outcome is the assessment report, which informs the copper mark's determination on whether the copper producer receives the copper mark. More information on specifically what must be included in the report is covered later on in this module. The copper mark assessor or assessment team is an individual or group of individuals with deep knowledge and expertise in environmental, social, governance, and supply chain assessments. The copper mark approves assessors individually based on their experience in each subject matter expertise. Assessors may be fully approved or partially approved for specific subject matters, geographies, or types of producer sites. For example, an assessor may be approved to assess environmental related RRA criteria at the mine level and in Latin America only. These assessors must be accompanied by other assessors who have received complementing approval to cover the full scope of the assessment. Copper producers must notify the copper mark prior to the assessment of the assessor selected in order to verify that there is coverage by approved assessors for the full scope of the assessment. Copper producers contract the assessor or assessment team directly, choosing from the list of approved assessors. Copper producers who wish to use assessors not on this list are required to contact the copper mark as soon as possible, but prior to the assessment, to discuss the approval process. Activities of the independent site assessment. According to the assurance process, the independent site assessment must be done within 12 months of signing the letter of commitment. Copper producers should begin to contract approved assessors as soon as possible after receiving the independent review report and understanding the scope of the assessment. The copper producer must inform the copper mark of the names of the assessor or assessors and the dates of the independent site assessment as soon as the assessor is selected and the assessment date is confirmed. This cannot be later than 1 month before the start date of the assessment. The time required for a site assessment will vary based on the scope of the assessment, as well as the size and complexity of the operations. For example, assessments at mine level with a full assessment scope may take 20 person days or 10 days on site for a team of 2 assessors. A mine with a limited assessment scope, because they have, for example, ISO 14001 and OSAS 18001 that cover multiple criteria, may take 14 person days or 7 days on site. A standalone smelter with a full assessment scope may take 10 person days or 5 days on site, and so on. This estimate does not include the time the assessor needs to prepare for the assessment or the time to complete the report after the assessment. When the assessment is complete, the assessors must submit the assessment report within 10 business days. The copper mark and the copper producer then have 10 business days to review and respond to the draft report before the assessor finalizes it, 10 business days after receiving feedback. The copper mark makes a determination within 10 days of receiving the final report. The independent site assessment is conducted in accordance with the ISO 19011 Guidelines for Auditing Management Systems, or ISAE 3000 International Standard on Assurance Engagements. Using these internationally recognized methodologies, the assessors assess conformance with the RRA criteria through corroboration of multiple data sources, including document and record review, interviews with management, workers, stakeholders, and site observations. Sampling, interviews, and documentation review must be conducted according to one of these 2 established assessment methodologies. The assessor's main goal during the independent site assessment is to issue a performance determination for each of the applicable RRA criteria. Assessors are not expected to review equivalency determinations during the site assessment, but are expected to bring to the attention of the copper mark and include in the report any areas of nonconformance observed against any of the copper mark criteria, even if equivalent conformance was determined during the independent desk-based review of the self-assessment. For example, consider a copper producer for whom criterion 5, child labor, is not in scope because it has been assessed on site through an equivalent system. If on site the copper mark assessor identifies cases of child labor, the assessor should, however, fully assess the copper producer for this criterion and raise the issue, assessment, and determination on child labor to the copper mark in the report. The copper mark assurance process requires assessors to take a risk-based approach to gather and analyze information systematically on a copper producer's performance against the RRA criteria. The common types of risks include inherent risks, the legal, social, and geographic context in which the copper producer operates. Control risks, the management system the copper producer has in place and the voluntary initiatives and responsible practices which the copper producer is active in or follows. And detection risk, the likelihood that the assessment methodology will identify nonconformances where they exist. The first activity of the assessment itself, then, is the planning and preparation. The assessors are expected to read the copper producer's self-assessment, the independent review report, supporting evidence, and any other background required to implement a risk-based approach. Assessors are expected to understand the copper producer's operations, business activities, supply chain, and context with a view to identify and assess risks that have the most potential to cause significant gaps between the operations practices and the expectations of the copper mark criteria. Based on this, the assessor should develop an agenda that ensures inclusion of all applicable criteria, adequate time to corroborate data sources, and prioritizes risk areas identified by the copper mark. The assessor and the copper producer work together to determine the logistics of the assessment, including any requirements for entry to the site, such as visas or passports, coordinating interviews with management and workers that least disrupts operations, and connecting with external stakeholders to plan for off-site engagements. Assessment activities. Whether the assessor uses the ISO 19001 or ISAE 3000 methodology, certain assessment activities are required by the copper mark. It is important that the assessor or assessment team conduct a thorough review of the available information to make an informed determination on the copper producer's ability to meet each of the applicable criteria. The assessment starts with an opening meeting to discuss the purpose of the assessment, the scope, the process, and the agenda. The agenda is particularly important to ensure access and availability to locations and individuals to be interviewed. Management is often present at the opening meeting to align expectations and to provide a general overview of the operations. While the independent reviewer checked that policies and procedures are available, it is the assessor's role to review those documents in detail to determine whether the policy in place meets the requirements of the RRA criteria in its design. The assessor will also review supporting procedures to assess whether there is consistent implementation of the policies at the operational level. This is complemented by risk-based sampling of interviews, records, and data that takes into account materiality, inherent risks, control risks, and detection risks. The assessor should define the sampling methodology in the report. The perspective of internal and external stakeholders forms an integral part of the assessment process. Assessments must include interviews with workers, for example, miners, line operators, and engineers, as well as contractors, for example, security, custodial staff, cafeteria staff, and any other outsourced workers. The purpose of these interviews is to verify the consistent implementation of policies and procedures in accordance with the RRA criteria. The pool of interviewees should span across functions, gender, age groups, ethnicity, and other factors to ensure a fair representation of workers and contractors. The assessor should define the sampling methodology in the report. Interviews should be conducted in a way that instills trust and confidence in the interviewee. For example, interviews should be done apart from management, in local language, off-site where possible, and in a culturally sensitive manner. Assessors should notify the copper mark of any potential incidences of coaching or coercion. Finally, the assessor must conduct stakeholder interviews with groups such as Indigenous peoples and local communities, NGOs, community organizations, upstream supply chain actors, and government entities as appropriate to the criteria and scope. For example, criteria such as 28 Indigenous peoples' rights necessitates conversations with the local Indigenous peoples. Similarly, an assessor could not conduct a complete assessment of criterion 24 on community development without speaking to members of the community. Like interviews with workers, these interviews should be conducted in a way that instills trust and confidence in the interviewee. Interviews should be done off-site and away from management, in local language, and in a culturally sensitive manner. Only assessors who have been proven experienced conducting stakeholder interviews are approved to do so by the copper mark. The assessment ends with a closing meeting, where the assessor asks any last questions, reviews follow-up information, and provides preliminary results, including potential improvement plans where appropriate. The assessor also uses the closing meeting to discuss next steps and refer outstanding process questions to the copper mark. Reporting and results. The assessor submits the report within 10 business days of completing the site assessment. The report must be in English, but may also be in a second language at the request of the copper producer. In the report, the assessor documents assessment conclusions based on the site assessment, indicating which criteria are does not meet, partially meets, and fully meets the RRA criteria. The report must indicate observations where applicable and ensure that potential risk areas raised by the copper mark are highlighted. When already determined, improvement plans should also be listed in the report. The report must include at a minimum the following information: copper producer company information, assessor information, including lead and team assessors, the assessment agenda, relevant copper mark criteria included in the assessment, the site or facility profile, including geographic scope, name of site, location, area, type of operation, current production or generation figures, and number of employees and contractors. A description of activities to verify conformance with each RRA criteria. A description of performance determination for each RRA criteria. The continuous improvement plan, if applicable, a list of documents reviewed, and the number and type of interviewees by stakeholder category, such as management, employees, contractors, communities, NGOs, government officials, etc. This report is owned by the copper producer. It's seen by the assessor, the copper producer, and the copper mark, unless the copper producer decides to share it with other parties as well. In conjunction with the copper mark, the assessor also prepares a summary assessment report with the key points from the full report, which is made public on the copper mark website. The copper mark has a template for this purpose, which includes the following information: the name of the site and unique copper mark number, the type of production facility, the duration of the site's copper mark and its expiry date, and the schedule for the next reassessment, date of the assessment activities and the assessment period, assessment activities and methodology, assessment conclusions, statement of conformance, and any non-applicable copper mark criteria. The copper mark will review the independent assessor's report and make a final decision within 10 business days of receiving the final report on whether the copper producer has met the requirements of the copper mark. The decision is based on the performance determination for the applicable criteria, which will be discussed more in training 2. If the copper mark is awarded, the information is documented, the logos and claims guide shared with the copper producer, and the summary report published on the website. Where there are opportunities for improvement, the copper producer then moves to step 4 of the assurance process. If there are none, the copper producer moves to step 5. Exceptions in assessments. In some cases, the assessor or the copper mark may request to have an additional party attend the independent site assessment. These may include interpreters or translators who help with local language interviews or document review, observers from the copper mark staff, or other observers, for example, trainee assessors or representatives from external organizations. This last category may only attend if the copper producer consents. Observers may not interfere with the assessment or the assessor's determination. The additional party will be subject to all policies and procedures of the copper mark, the copper producer, and the assessor or assessment firm, and may be required to sign a confidentiality agreement. As a general rule, every applicable criteria must be assessed on site and cannot be substituted by remote assessments. A remote assessment is an off-site assessment where the assessor or assessment team are not physically present at the facility. The scope of the assessment is the same as an on-site assessment, although the format is changed. A remote assessment is a virtual assessment, which utilizes technology to visually review components of the assessment that are normally observed in person. The remote assessment should be differentiated from a desktop assessment, which only reviews the documents and records of a site. In some rare instances, due to access and travel restrictions imposed, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the copper mark may consider remote assessment for a participating copper producer for some criteria. This is determined on a case-by-case basis after review of all available information. This brings us to the end of Module 4. Thank you for your participation.